Hello everyone, welcome to another new class of human physiology. In this class, we will discuss about thyroid and how the thyroid hormones are synthesized. So, if you remember in last few classes, we are discussing about like different endocrine glands, and some of the endocrine glands we covered in details, for example like pancreas. This class will cover about our thyroid gland, and we will see like how thyroid gland synthesis different type of endocrine hormones and like what are their specific roles in our body. So, let us stay with it. So, what different contents will be covered for this class? As we said, like we will first discuss about like thyroid gland, and then we will see like how the synthesis of different thyroid hormone happens in our body. Further, we will also see like effect of thyroid on the body, and just briefly we will tell about hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism. In the next class, we will thoroughly discuss about like different endocrine disease, and there it would be covered in detail. So, as you see like thyroid gland is like a butterfly shape type of gland, and it is located in the anterior neck just inferior to the larynx. And as you know, like the function of thyroid gland is like to synthesize the thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormones have like very crucial role in terms of our metabolic activity. So, in terms of thyroid hormone synthesis, there are like different role of other hormones also. So, let us see, and also like let us see what are different type of steps that is involved in synthesis of the thyroid hormone. So, in this table you can see in the first step like the hormone which is secreted from the hypothalamus, which is called like thyroid releasing hormone. This TRH or the thyroid releasing hormone eventually stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to secrete the thyroid stimulating hormone. Once the thyroid stimulating hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary, it comes to our blood circulation, and eventually it goes to the thyroid gland. In the thyroid gland, there are certain steps that happen sequentially. So, you can see like the first step happens, which is thyroglobulin production, that happens in the thyroid follicular cells. After that, the sodium iodide symporter cause like the iodide uptake. After the iodide uptake, iodine oxidation happen by function of thyroid peroxidase enzyme. After the iodine oxidation, thyroglobulin iodination happen, followed by MTT and DIT coupling, and eventually thyroglobulin proteolysis happen. So, these all steps starting from the thyroglobulin production to the thyroglobulin proteolysis is all part of the thyroid hormone synthesis, and this happens in various cell and compartment of the thyroid gland. And eventually once the thyroid hormones is produced, the thyroxine binding globulin protein or the TBG protein eventually binds with the T3 and T4 enzymes, and it gets circulated throughout the body. In terms of thyroid hormone synthesis, there is this specific T organ that plays crucial role, and we have to know like why and how. So, the first one, which is mostly like the first major component of the organ involved in the thyroid hormone synthesis, which is the hypothalamus, because in the last slide also we said that hypothalamus produce the TRH or the thyroid releasing hormone. Once this TRH is produced, TRH comes and stimulates the anterior pituitary gland. So, TRH, once it produced by the hypothalamus, it comes out and stimulates the anterior pituitary gland, and eventually it stimulates the production of the TSH, which is a thyroid stimulating hormone. Again, same way thyroid stimulating hormone comes in the bloodstream, and it goes to the thyroid gland for the following cascades. So, in general, this hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland and thyroid gland together is called as hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis or HPT axis. So, this is very important to know that hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis or the HPT axis is the important and crucial component for the synthesis and development of our different thyroid hormone. Now let us see that how the step by step thyroid hormones get synthesized, right. So the first step, as we said, that hypothalamus, which is present in our brain, you can see the hypothalamus, and it has like a very specific type of cell, for example, which is like a paraventricular nuclei. So this paraventricular nuclei type of cells in the hypothalamus, they secrete the TRH, which is the thyroid releasing hormone. Once this TRH is secreted from the paraventricular nucleus of hypothalamus, it comes out and through the hypophyseal portal system, it goes to the anterior pituitary and it stimulates the anterior pituitary. Once it stimulates the anterior pituitary, it secretes another hormone, which is TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone. So once, as we said, once the thyroid releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary, it secretes a peptide type of hormone, which is the TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone. Now this thyroid stimulating hormone comes to the bloodstream, it goes to the thyroid gland to start the synthesis of different thyroid hormone like triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine, which are T3 and T4. And then once the T3 and T4 are synthesized in the thyroid, eventually again it goes out to the bloodstream and to the target tissue for different function. Important to highlight that TSH is a peptide type of hormone. Now as we said that once the TSH is secreted, TSH comes into the circulation and eventually goes to the thyroid gland. In the thyroid gland, there are like different thyroid follicles or follicular cells. So you can see here these in the thyroid gland, you will see like this specific like circular type of thyroid cells or follicular cells. Sometimes they are also called as thyrocyte. And inside of this cluster of thyroid cells or thyrocytes, there is this lumen space which is called as colloid. So there is this lumen space which is called as colloid or which is filled with a substance called colloid. And once TSH comes in the circulation, in this type of thyrocytes or the thyroid cluster cells, there is a thyroid stimulating hormone receptor. So what here it is present, there is a receptor for thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, and this TSH hormone eventually comes here and binds to this thyroid hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone receptor. And once this is bind with the thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, the TSH eventually comes inside of this cell of the thyrocytes and start production of the thyroglobulin followed by the different thyroid hormones. So let us see how the step by step this synthesis happens. So as we said that in this thyroid cluster cells or thyrocytes, what we have? We have TSHR receptor. We have TSHR receptor, which is thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, and now this TSH hormone or the thyroid stimulating hormone comes to the circulation and binds to this thyroid stimulating hormone receptor. So once thyroid stimulating hormone binds to the TSHR receptor, what it does basically, this TSH eventually promotes or stimulates the follicular cells to produce or synthesize thyroglobulin type of molecule. So basically this type of protein molecule like thyroglobulin type of molecule, the synthesis of the molecule gets highly stimulated once the TSH gets binded with the TSHR receptor. So in the next step, like this is one of the most important component for the thyroid hormone synthesis, thyroglobulin. Another important component for the thyroid hormone synthesis are the iodide. Okay. So together once the thyroglobulin and the iodide get combined, it produces the thyroid type of hormone. So where from we will get the iodide? Basically we consume like different type of food, as you know, and iodine is like one of the component of the food nutrients. So basically we consume like iodine from the food, and eventually that iodine can get ionized into like iodide ion, which is the I minus. Now this I minus ion is basically going, or like it is present in the bloodstream. Generally iodide ions are highly concentrated inside of the thyroid cells or the follicular cells, but they are generally like low in amount in the bloodstream. That means the iodide ion or the I minus ion have to go inside of these thyroid cells against their concentration gradient. So what I am saying, that iodide ions are low in concentration in the blood, and iodide ions are generally high in concentration inside of the follicular cells. That means it needs to go against its concentration gradient. Now who helps for that? Sodium ion. As you remember that sodium, when it goes inside, it also helps iodide ion in a secondary active co-transport mechanism. So sodium ion, in terms of like kind of a piggyback, basically takes the iodine ion in like on top of it, and it helps the iodide ion to cross the barrier and to come into the follicular cells in a mechanism called sodium iodide co-transport mechanism. So in a mechanism called sodium iodide co-transport mechanism, right? And this mechanism, if you remember our cellular transport class, we told that the secondary active transport directly don't use the ATP, but all the secondary active transports are highly dependent on the primary sodium potassium ATPase pump to initially build the sodium concentration gradient. So thus this sodium iodide secondary active co-transport pump eventually indirectly use the ATP for this process. So let's see like what happens to the iodide then. So in this way, iodide from the low concentration which is present in the blood with help of sodium goes inside of these follicular cells. Now there is another receptor which is called penguin receptor. So this iodide ion through this concentration gradient, because here iodide concentration is much higher, in the colloidal space of these thyroid cluster cells iodide concentration is low. So basically like a protein mediated diffusion or the uptake happens, and penguin type of protein receptor or transporter, it facilitates the movement of iodide ion from the follicular cells to the colloid space. So in this way, in the colloid space of the cell, now what we have? We have thyroglobulin, abundant amount of thyroglobulin, also we have abundant amount of iodide ion. Now let's see like what is the next step. So once this iodide ion comes inside of this colloidal part, right, inside of the colloidal part, this iodide ion gets oxidized to iodine. So this iodide ion gets oxidized to iodine by an enzyme called TPO, which is the thyroid peroxidase. So enzyme which is present in those thyroid cells or in the cuboid or the colloid part, which is the thyroid peroxidase, this basically oxidize the iodide ion to the iodine or I2. This is called iodide oxidation step. Then next see like what happens in the next step. Once the oxidation happens, so from the iodide ion it converts to the iodine. So after this oxidation step, then the next step which happens is the iodination of the tyrosine. So what is basically tyrosine? This is the thyroglobulin which initially got stimulated or overproduced by the effect of the TSH, right? And this thyroglobulin protein eventually it came out to the colloidal space. Now thyroglobulin protein has different amino acid, and tyrosine is one of the most important. Tyrosine is the one of the most prominent and important amino acid which is present in the thyroglobulin. Now once the iodine which gets oxidized by from the iodide. Eventually what happens is like the iodination happens. So iodine get conjugated or bound with this tyrosine type of amino acid residues. Okay, let's rehearse one more time. So what we just said, that initially TSH, which binds to the TSHR receptor, stimulates the production of thyroglobulin protein from the follicular cells, which eventually go inside of the colloid cell. Same way, iodide, through the process of sodium iodide secondary co-transport mechanism, iodide ion comes inside of the follicular cells. From there, using the penguin protein transporter, it goes to the colloid space. Then this iodide ion get oxidized and become iodine. Once the iodine form, eventually on the thyroglobulin protein there are a lot of tyrosine amino acid residues, and these iodine molecules eventually gets bind to this tyrosine molecule either in a one number, then it will called as monoiodotyrosine. So MIT, which is like monoiodotyrosine, or it can also bind in number 2, or two molecules can also bind to the tyrosine, which will be called as diiodotyrosine. So if one molecule of iodine gets bind to the tyrosine, which will call as MIT or monoiodotyrosine, and if two molecules bind, which will called as diiodotyrosine. So this process is also called iodination. Now let's see what is the next step. So once this DIT and MIT or the iodination happens, right? So we now have DIT and MIT. In case of DIT, how many iodine is there? 2. In case of MIT, how many iodine is there? Only 1, right? After this step, what happens is like that the TPO enzyme, which is like playing role in all the other step, right? So we just skip this thing, that here also thyroid peroxidase or the TPO enzyme only, this only reacts and actually trigger this step of iodination. Okay, so this I just missed to say, but same enzyme TPO here also it actually affects. So in this step, when the DIT and MIT forms, the coupling reaction happens between them. Okay, so for example, what we have DIT and we have MIT. Now if two DIT gets coupled, then we will get T4 thyroid hormone or the thyroxine hormone, and then if one molecule of MIT and one molecule of DIT gets coupled, we will get T3 or triiodothyronine hormone. Okay, and which enzyme again is helpful or again triggered this conversion? Same way, the TPO enzyme or the thyroid peroxidase enzyme, which is basically eventually triggering all this step of iodine oxidation, then like iodination followed by the coupling. So eventually after the coupling, by the activity of the TPO, what we get? We get T3, which is the triiodothyronine hormone, and then also we get T4, which is the tetraiodothyronine hormone or the thyroxine hormone. Okay, so eventually T3 and T4 are the active thyroid hormone that gets produced with the thyroglobulin inside of the thyroglobulin colloid. But one thing, now they are still attached with the thyroglobulin moiety, right? So they are still attached with the thyroglobulin molecule. So T3 and T4, even though they are synthesized, they are still attached with the thyroglobulin type of protein molecule. So let's see, as we said, the T3 and T4 after the coupling reaction by the activity of the TPO, the T3 and T4 is still coupled with the thyroglobulin type of protein molecule. Now the T3 and T4 needs to basically come inside along with the thyroglobulin. So what happens basically? Endocytosis happen. So endocytosis actually cause the T3 and T4 along with the thyroglobulin to basically endocytose or bring it inside of the follicular cell. And once it comes to the follicular cell, proteolytic enzyme activity eventually break down the bond between the thyroglobulin and the T3 T4, releasing the T3 and T4 from the out of the thyroglobulin. So what we just said, that initially after the coupling, T3 and T4 is still there with the thyroglobulin residue and the protein. Basically the molecule, with the process of endocytosis, it comes inside of the follicular cells from the colloidal part or the colloid part, and eventually once it comes inside of the follicular cells, the proteolytic enzyme activity cleaves or degrades the bond between the T3 T4 and the thyroglobulin, releasing the T3 and the T4. So now what we have, after the proteolytic enzyme activity, we have the T3 and T4 inside of the follicular cells. This T3 and T4 basically gets released and comes inside the bloodstream, where this thyroxine binding globulin protein, this thyroxine binding globulin protein or the TBG eventually get attached or bind with the T3 and T4, and then basically it distributes and circulates to different type of organ. So what happens, eventually the T3 and T4 gets bind with the thyroxine binding globulin protein or TBG, and along with this binding condition they get spreaded and they get distributed across the various body organ. So this is the whole mechanism. If we quickly rehearse what we said, first we have hypothalamus, right? So hypothalamus secretes thyroid releasing hormone that eventually stimulates the anterior pituitary, and once the anterior pituitary is secreted, it releases the TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone. This TSH eventually comes and binds with the receptor which is called TSHR receptor, right, which is the TSHR receptor, and once it is bind with the TSHR receptor, it basically stimulates the production of the thyroglobulin from the follicular cells. Eventually the thyroglobulin goes to the colloid cell. Same way we need one more important component for the thyroid hormone production, which is the iodide. Iodine is which we get as a nutrient from different food, get ionized as iodide by the action of sodium iodide co-transport mechanism, which is a secondary active transport mechanism. Iodide gets internalized inside of the follicular cells, and using like the pendrin type of protein transporter, it gets pumped out in the colloid space. And now once we have both thyroglobulin and the iodide at first, like with the activity of this enzyme which is the thyroid peroxidase or the TPO, it converts iodide to the iodine. Once it is converted to the iodine, iodination happen. So in the thyroglobulin we said there is the amino acid which is the tyrosine. So either iodination happen with one molecule of iodine which is called MIT, or iodination can happen with two molecules of iodine which is called DIT. So once this DIT and MIT forms, they can couple again by the action of TPA to form either the T3 which is the triiodothyronine or the T4 which is the tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine. Eventually they are still coupled. So what happens, they get endocytosed inside of the cells, follicular cells, where the proteolytic enzyme eventually cleave up between the bonds between the T3 T4 and thyroglobulin. Now this T3 and T4 comes inside the bloodstream, and with the help of thyroxine binding globulin protein or TBG, eventually in this binding condition they get distributed to various organs for their function. So hopefully you understood the whole mechanism of thyroid synthesis, thyroid hormone synthesis to eventually produce T3 and T4. Now let us briefly discuss what are different effects of thyroid in our body. So in the cellular level, basically it increases the protein synthesis and metabolic activity, and that is why we say thyroid hormones are highly important for our metabolic activity. So in this way this increases the overall metabolism, and as you know, once the metabolism is increased, it produces heat, right, because it is ATP, like as you know, like in that ion transport class also we mentioned that it kind of stimulates the sodium glucose pathway and other metabolic pathway, that also further it stimulates like the ATP production. So overall it generates like lot of heat. In the heart, it increase the number and sensitivity of the beta 1 receptor. Beta 1 androgenic receptors found in the heart that can bind to the epinephrine and the norepinephrine. In this way, it is involved in fight or flight type of sympathetic response. So, in our neurology class, we will discuss about like fight and flight in terms of sympathetic neurons. There we will further discuss about it. Okay. So, same way like thyroid hormones also increase the heart rate. It increase like the stroke volume due to the increase of the heart or cardiac contraction. Thus, in this way, it can increase the cardiac output and blood pressure. In the GI system, thyroid hormones can increase the metabolic activity within the GI tract, which increases the GL motility and secretion. In the CNS or the central nervous system, it can increase the neurogenesis, myelation, also dendritic formation. It can also increase overall activity of sympathetic nervous system. It can help in terms of like increasing subcutaneous blood flow and maintaining the skin homeostasis and proliferation of the skin cells. It also stimulates like the sweat glands and oil secretion. It also stimulates and for like hair and other nail growth. So, as you can see, thyroid hormones has so many applications in terms of like metabolic activity and along with that nervous system and growth also. So, let us think about it, which thyroid hormone is more active, what is the main role of T3 and T4, what does the thyroid gland need to produce hormone. Okay. So, you can read further about T3 and T4 and find out their specific role in our body. Okay. Hopefully, you like the today's class. You can consult different textbooks including like Tortora and other books and even medical physiology books by Guyton. So, these all books you can refer. If you have any further questions, please discuss with us during live session. You can also drop your questions via email. Hopefully, you are enjoying the class. Today we discussed about in details how the thyroid synthesis like happens, and we also discussed their brief functions, that how the thyroid hormones play important role in different metabolic activity and growth in our body. So, thank you again. Hopefully, we will soon meet with another new class of human physiology very soon. Thank you.